When the last ice age ended, the world did not gently change. It was reshaped. Imagine standing on a coastal plain where your ancestors hunted for generations. The sea is distant, a blue line on the horizon. Your children play near caves decorated with handprints. Then, within a single lifetime, the water arrives. Not slowly, but in surges that swallow valleys, erase hunting grounds, and force entire communities to flee inland. This happened. Large areas of land were lost to rising water. Human communities were displaced. And from that disruption came something unexpected: stability, structure, and eventually, civilization. This is the story of what came after the flood. This documentary follows that recovery, the new geography that survivors faced, the slow return of stable climates, the emergence of agriculture, the first ritual monuments, and the memory of loss preserved in stories and stone. We won't search for miracles or lost continents. We'll follow evidence, sea level records from marine geology, radiocarbon-dated archaeological sites, and the shared traces of memory left by people who lived through the end of an old world in the beginning of a new one. The analysis presented here draws on decades of peer-reviewed research in archaeology, climate science, and comparative mythology, where modern computational methods help interpret patterns in data, such as mapping submerged coastlines or analyzing settlement distributions. They serve as tools to reveal what the evidence shows, not to replace it. What follows is not speculation. It is a reconstruction based on the best available science of how humanity's survivors rebuilt, remembered, and eventually created the foundations of the civilized world we inherit today. When the last great ice sheets began their final retreat, the face of the Earth changed faster than most of us can imagine today. Between roughly 15,000 and 8,000 years ago, global sea level rose by approximately 120 meters, nearly 400 feet, as continental ice melted and freshwater flowed back into the oceans. According to research published in Nature Geoscience and referenced extensively in paleoclimate studies, some of that rise happened in dramatic pulses rather than gradual increases. Geologists identify one of the largest events as Meltwater Pulse 1A, which occurred around 14,600 years ago. During this event, sea levels rose by approximately 16 to 25 meters in just 3 to 5 centuries, rates roughly 10 times faster than current sea level rise. Stand on any modern beach and try to picture the water rising a meter every 15 years. That's the scale of change coastal communities faced during these pulses. The result was not a slow creeping of the shoreline, but the rapid drowning of broad coastal plains, river deltas, and the low-lying lands that had supported Mesolithic peoples for millennia. But sea level was only part of the story. The end of the Pleistocene included abrupt climate disruptions, such as the Younger Dryas, a period of sudden cooling around 12,900 to 11,700 years ago that briefly reversed warming trends across the Northern Hemisphere. According to Encyclopedia Britannica's overview of this period, that abrupt change affected precipitation patterns, vegetation zones, and animal migrations across entire regions, creating additional environmental stress for human groups already dealing with rising waters and shifting coastlines. Consider the physical reality. The world that survivors inhabited was familiar in outline, but transformed in detail. Coastlines they had known since childhood were gone. River courses had shifted as glacial meltwater carved new channels. Wetlands were submerged. Migration corridors, the paths their ancestors had followed for thousands of years, had changed or disappeared entirely beneath the waves. We can see the fingerprints of these events in submerged landscapes. Doggerland, documented extensively by marine archaeologists and featured in National Geographic's coverage of underwater archaeology, was once a broad, habitable plain connecting Britain to continental Europe. Over several thousand years of the early Holocene, it was progressively flooded by rising seas and finally fragmented by a combination of steady sea level rise and catastrophic events, including a massive tsunami around 6200 BCE triggered by the Storegga submarine landslide off Norway's coast. In many regions around the world, archaeologists now discover Stone Age settlements preserved under the sea or compressed into narrow coastal refuges. These sites reveal a pattern. People lived close to now submerged lands, and those lands were lost within just a few generations, a geological instant, but a catastrophe in human time. Those losses forced communities to make impossible choices. They moved inland to higher ground, into new ecological zones where familiar resources didn't exist. The very maps people carried in their minds, the routes, the hunting grounds, the sacred places where their ancestors were buried, were erased by water. This is the world into which the survivors stepped, a world that required new choices, new social arrangements, and eventually new technologies to cope with the geography that had betrayed them. When the coastlines drowned, people did not vanish, they adapted. What archaeologists find in the sediment layers from this period is a pattern of dispersal and concentration, small bands scattering from lost lowlands and reassembling around rivers, springs, and higher terraces. Picture families arriving at a river valley already occupied by others, strangers who speak a different dialect, who have their own traditions, yet survival demanded cooperation. These survivors were mobile, flexible, and highly skilled at extracting resources from marginal landscapes, estuaries, marsh edges, and river systems that still supplied fish, shellfish, and seasonal plants. According to archaeological surveys reported by the Associated Press in their coverage of Mediterranean coastal research, evidence from submerged sites in coastal sediments shows communities initially clustering around now submerged continental shelves and river mouths, then gradually occupying inland river valleys where water and fertile soils concentrated, lifelines in a transformed world. Survival required more than individual skill. Food scarcity and unpredictable seasons made sharing and coordinated labor not merely beneficial, but necessary for survival. In many regions across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, excavations reveal an archaeological signal of growing investment in local resources. More sophisticated fishing gear, including bone hooks and weighted nets, more permanent stone hearths, and shell middens that indicate communities were returning to the same locations repeatedly rather than constantly moving. Oral traditions and myths appear in this context not as mere entertainment, but as pragmatic survival tools. When people fled drowned coasts and crowded into river valleys, they carried stories with them, warnings about seasons, about where fish would run and where floods would strike, and tales of places that no longer existed but whose lessons remained relevant. These stories shaped critical decisions: where to build permanent shelters, when to plant the first experimental crops, and how to organize cooperative labor for fishing or hunting. It is tempting to imagine civilization as a product of long, uninterrupted stability. People settle in one place, farms gradually yield surpluses, and cities appear naturally, like fruit ripening on a tree. The post-flood archaeological record suggests a more complicated and interesting sequence. Catastrophe created specific pressures that favored certain innovations. Where refugees concentrated along rivers and in protected valleys, the need for reliable food and predictable storage became acute. Seasonal resources, the migrating herds, the annual salmon runs, the predictable shellfish beds, could no longer be counted on because the geography that supported them had changed. Systems that reduced risk and increased predictability became attractive because they improved the odds of surviving the next bad year. According to research synthesized in Nature's coverage of agricultural origins, archaeologists now argue that in many parts of the world, agriculture and the social structures supporting it gained traction precisely when people needed to stabilize food supplies after major disruptions. The pattern repeats across regions. Environmental stress, population concentration, experimentation with plant cultivation, and eventually full agricultural commitment. Stability emerged from chaos, not before it. The disruption itself created conditions that made larger communities and the economic surplus needed for specialized labor not just possible, but necessary. The major river valleys offered a critical advantage in this transformed world. The Nile in Egypt, the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia, the Indus in South Asia, and the Yellow River in China all concentrated water in nutrient-rich sediment, continuously rebuilding fertile floodplains even as distant coastlines drowned. As UNESCO World Heritage Center documentation of early urban sites confirms, these valleys became refuges where displaced human groups could intensify plant cultivation and animal management in ways that weren't possible in the marginal lands to which they'd initially fled. Recovering from catastrophic loss meant learning to control and store water through irrigation and canals, to reshape landscapes with terraces and raised fields, and to create social rules for sharing both the labor required for these investments and the benefits they produced. It meant developing systems to resolve disputes about water rights, to organize construction projects, to store grain against future famines, and to coordinate defense against rival groups competing for the same limited resources. In many ways, what we call civilization was an adaptive response, a long, laborious, multi-generational communal strategy to make the world safer and more predictable after it had proven dangerous and unpredictable. The survivors didn't set out to build civilization, they set out to survive. Civilization was what resulted from their collective solutions to the problems the flood had created. When people lack durable written records, memory must be preserved through other means: story, ritual, landscape modification, and repeated practice embedded so deeply in culture that forgetting becomes almost impossible. Flood stories recur across every inhabited continent, from the Epic of Gilgamesh in ancient Mesopotamia to indigenous Australian Dreamtime narratives, from the biblical account of Noah to Native American tales from the Pacific Northwest. These aren't identical scripts copied from a single source. They're independent traditions sharing structural elements, great waters that transform the world, chosen survivors who preserve knowledge, and a fundamental rupture between the world that was and the world that is. According to comparative analysis and folklore studies summarized in scholarly overviews including Wikipedia's extensive compilation of flood myth research, these tales function as compressed cultural knowledge. They encode warnings about particular dangerous places, preserve information about seasonal patterns and environmental risks, and transmit cultural rules about where and how to live safely. For societies that had lost coastal homelands within living memory, such stories weren't religious mythology separate from practical life. They were practical inheritance, telling each generation where danger once struck and why certain places must be avoided or treated with respect. If we search for the earliest physical signs of collective, organized labor coordinated across many families or bands, we often find ritual or memorial structures appearing before palaces, before granaries, and before written records. Göbekli Tepe, located in southeastern Anatolia in modern Turkey, stands as perhaps the most striking example. Dated to roughly 9600 to 8200 BCE and extensively documented by UNESCO World Heritage Center, this site consists of massive stone enclosures and intricately carved pillars erected by communities often described by archaeologists as pre-agricultural hunter-gatherers rather than sedentary farmers. Some of the T-shaped limestone pillars stand over 5 meters tall and weigh up to 10 tons. Moving, shaping, and erecting them required substantial cooperation, planning, and the ability to feed workers during construction, indicators of organizational capacity we typically associate with much later urban civilizations. The scale of labor invested in these structures tells us something important. People devoted significant time and resources to building places whose primary function appears to be ritual gathering and collective memory rather than defense, grain storage, or habitation. That investment suggests that communal rituals and memorialization played a direct, practical role in organizing large groups of people before formal political states, writing systems, or professional administrators emerged. But why build monuments at all? Why invest precious calories in moving stones instead of gathering more food? One answer lies in what anthropologists call social bonding. Monuments create gathering places for rituals that bring dispersed bands together. They facilitate feasting, a social mechanism for redistributing resources, establishing obligations, and building reputations that extend beyond immediate family groups. After a cataclysmic flood that had scattered and mixed populations, shared rituals served obvious practical functions, binding survivors from different original communities, coordinating rebuilding efforts, and rehearsing the social roles and cooperative behaviors needed for larger collective projects like constructing terraces, maintaining early irrigation channels, or building communal grain storage. Monuments also serve as physical anchors for memory. A stone pillar carved with animal figures, a circle of standing stones, or an earthen mound can function as a durable reminder, one that lasts far longer than human lifetimes, of what was lost, why the community formed, and why vigilance and cooperation remain necessary. In this way, ritual architecture functions as both symbolic and practical infrastructure. Furthermore, monuments signal capacity. If a group can divert hundreds or thousands of hours of labor from direct subsistence activities into construction, it demonstrates surplus, either the logistical capability to feed workers during building seasons, or a social consensus that such investments serve the common good strongly enough to justify the cost. Over decades and centuries, the repeated rituals and the physical infrastructure they created, including storage pits, raised platforms, communal ovens, and gathering spaces, could shift a society from seasonal encampments to permanent villages, the crucial next steps toward urban life. Recovery from catastrophe is a marathon, not a sprint. The archaeological and paleo-environmental records show consistently that population recovery, technological innovations, and the expansion of trade networks unfold over many generations, often centuries. After coastlines disappeared and familiar landscapes drowned, people slowly, incrementally adapted. They improved fishing technologies, developing better nets, hooks, and traps. They domesticated plants and animals in new regions where wild ancestors were available. They learned to manage water through ditches, channels, and early irrigation systems that extended the reach of rivers into adjacent drylands. According to Live Science's coverage of Neolithic technology development, these processes required stable environmental conditions and multi-generational knowledge transfer. Grandparents teaching parents, parents teaching children, each generation building slightly on what the previous generation had learned. The demographic and technological progress we collectively call the rise of civilization accumulated through repeated small gains rather than sudden breakthroughs. Slightly better crop yields one generation, longer storage life for grain in the next, more reliable trade routes in the generation after that. Each gain built on the social systems, the accumulated knowledge in the physical infrastructure that emerged in the wake of the post-flood crisis. Trade played an especially critical role in accelerating this recovery. As communities specialized, developing expertise in pottery production in one valley, stone tool manufacture in another region, textile weaving somewhere else, exchange networks formed to connect these dispersed centers of production. Trade spreads innovations faster than isolated invention typically produces them. Archaeological finds of non-local materials, documented in National Geographic's educational resources on early trade, indicate exchange routes forming early in the Holocene period, linking river valleys and coastal refuges across distances that would have taken weeks to travel. These networks moved more than just goods. They transmitted ideas, farming techniques adapted to different soils, architectural plans for grain storage, ritual practices, decorative styles, and probably languages and stories. Over hundreds of years, these exchanges raised baseline prosperity across interconnected regions and created the stability necessary for urbanization. Rebuilding after the flood therefore required not only physical labor, the actual work of planting, building, and manufacturing, but also the slow, sometimes painful evolution of governance systems that could sustain long-term projects across generations and manage the inevitable conflicts that arise when people live in permanent, densely populated settlements. Today's sea level rise is slower than the fastest post-glacial pulses like Meltwater Pulse 1A, but it is accelerating. More importantly, modern populations are concentrated in coastal regions at an intensity ancient societies never approached. According to recent paleo studies covered by Live Science, Holocene sea level change reshaped habitable lands dramatically across the globe, and human societies repeatedly had to make hard choices: abandon coastal settlements, attempt to defend them with engineering, or fundamentally reorganize how and where they lived. Those adjustments took time, social consensus, and collective will. We have less time now and vastly greater infrastructure at risk: entire cities, ports that handle global trade, agricultural regions feeding billions, industrial facilities and transportation networks all concentrated in coastal zones that will be increasingly affected by rising seas and intensifying storms. The archaeological record of lost coastal lands and submerged settlements offers concrete historical parallels for the choices confronting us now. Our ancestors faced similar decisions on a smaller scale. Some communities successfully relocated inland. Others tried to hold their ground and failed, their former settlements now discovered by marine archaeologists. The difference today is one of scale, not kind. There is also an ethical lesson embedded in how post-flood communities responded to catastrophic loss. The societies that successfully rebuilt did so by sharing risk, actively preserving and transmitting memory across generations, and investing in public works, monuments, irrigation systems, storage facilities, defensive walls that benefited many people over long time spans rather than enriching a few in the short term. The great floods of the post-glacial period did not end humanity's story, they changed its shape, forcing innovations that ultimately led to the civilized world we inherit. Civilization, as we recognize it, is as much a record of recovery as it is of invention. Our monuments, our myths, and our cities bear the imprint of people who kept working, kept cooperating, and kept adapting to make life predictable and safe after the world became unpredictable and dangerous. That continuity, the combination of ingenuity, memory, and social will, is the same human capacity we need now. We are living in a period of environmental change. History shows both cautionary examples of societies that failed to adapt and inspiring examples of societies that succeeded. Our species knows how to rebuild, but rebuilding at the scale we face requires planning, cooperation, and the humility to learn from those who survived catastrophe before us and left us their lessons in stone, in story, and in the very landscape we inhabit.